So today we are going to talk about one of the very common mistake that people make at the beginner level when while working with useEffect. So I know most of you are already familiar with useEffect and why we use. Generally, we use useEffect to make any side effect in our React, making API calls, loading some data asynchronously. So we will see that. So basically, this problem is when you try to make the useEffect callback async, and generally what happens is that when you make this mistake, it doesn't get caught up at the compile time. At the compilation level, it only gives you an error, but when you go and access your component in the browser at the runtime, your app will crash, right? And if your application do not have an error boundary, then it will crash your whole application. So it's really bad. And I have seen doing a lot of code reviews that a lot of beginners have made this mistake. So let me walk you through the problem, and I will also explain what the problem is, why it happens, and how to solve this problem. So yeah, let's jump. You can see that we have a pretty simple React app. So I have basically I'm rendering a list of users. So generally, I'm gonna show you the code also in some time. So I'm just making this is a React application. You can see running on local development server, and I'm just fetching the list of users and then rendering it on top of it, right? So no fancy things, a pretty easy one for our demo purposes, right? Now let's see that let's just go through the let me walk you through the code of this. So you can see that this is the code, right? So what we are doing is that we have basically a URL, then we have created two flags. One is loading, another is user list. So what I'm doing is that I'm just fetching the user list, right? So this is my fetch function, which basically first set the loading as true, and then it make a API call, get the data, and then I'm just rendering only 10 users. So you can see that there is, this is for that, and then I'm updating my state, and then I'm also updating the loading to false, right? So pretty simple, nothing fancy here, right? Also in order to make sure that to avoid any re-renders after the state updates, this is I'm passing an empty array, so it will behave like the component did mount function in class, right? So let me walk you through let me walk you through basically the code. Okay, so code is done. Let me walk you through the application, right? So let's do one thing. Let me refresh this page. So if you see that the moment I refresh for a second, you'll see this loading, and then the API call happens and it updates, right? So no fancy, everything is good. But generally when you get started, there is something very easy to make mistake, right? And let me actually show you what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do is that let's go here, and what I'm going to do is as of now what I'm doing is that this fetch user list is a function which is doing all the job for me, right? So it is just fetching the data from the API and just setting it in the state, right? And because fetching a data from the internet, it's a asynchronous operation, so that's why we are using await, right? And in order to use await, we have made this function async, right? So everything sorted. Now sometimes what happens is that when you basically as a beginner, or I think it's very easy to make the mistake, what we do is that in spite of writing this whole code in a function and then calling that function inside useEffect, what people do is that people actually write the whole logic of making the API call and updating the state inside the useEffect itself, right? So they do something like this. Now as soon as you start using await, what it will start throwing an error and says that, okay man, you're trying to use await, you have to basically make your parent function async, right? Because you can only use await either at the global level or inside a async function. So what people do is that they basically make this callback async, right? It's pretty easy. Why? Because as soon as you make this one, the error goes, right? So the error is gone, but you can see that my VS Code has started showing me some warnings because I have the IntelliJ extension installed in my code editor, right? So it just show it. I think by default these days it shows it, even though if you have IntelliJ installed or not, right? But this doesn't give you any error. This will work. If you compile the code, this will not give you. It will only give you a warning. As you can see that there is no red errors that earlier when it was showing up when I was using it, right? So yeah, but this is bad, right? This will break your code, right? Pretty easy to make this mistake. And I remember that when I started learning React, I had made this mistake in the starting. But the question is that why this will create a problem, right? So let me first walk you actually show you the code. So I've compiled the code. Let's go through the application and see if there is any error that is occurring there or not, right? So what I'm gonna do is, yeah, cool. So now the moment I refresh this code, you will see that there is an error, and the error is that destroy is not a function, right? The question is why this error, what is happening here, right? So in order to understand this, let's first understand how async function works, right? So let's do one thing. Let me basically show you basically the way async works, right? So what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna create a function called add, and this will basically take two values, and pretty simple, it will return two values, right? So addition of two values, nothing fancy. And then what I'm gonna do is that the moment I call 4 comma 5, you will see that the it returns a value called 9, right? But what happens if I make this function async, right? So let me do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this function async, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this add again, right? But you see the difference here, it doesn't return a value, right? It was expecting a number or a value to be returned, but it returned a promise, right? So what happens is that async functions return a promise which gets resolved after some time, right? And it basically telling to the browser that, hey man, I'm going to basically perform some asynchronous operation inside this function. So browser basically returns your promise. Now the problem here is that if you go to the documentation of useEffect, right? I don't know if any of you know, but just go to the documentation and see that the callback function that we basically we use here in the useEffect, right? Uh, the documentation says that inside from this callback function, either you return a function which will be called when the function will when your component gets unmounted, right? So it perform cleanup. Remember that destroy error. That destroy is basically your browser is calling that destroy function to clean up at the time of unmounting of your component, to basically perform some cleanup, right? So by using that function, it basically performs some cleanup at the time of unmounting. But if you do not return anything, that's fine, right? So this callback either it do not return anything, or it return a function, right? So the function that you will return will be called at the time of your component get unmounted, right? So that's how it happens. But here what happens is that the moment you make async, we are not returning anything from this callback function, but because you have made async, it returns a promise, right? Now you're no longer returning a function, you are returning a promise. And when JavaScript expect that whatever you are returning, that should be a function. You don't return it all anything, that's fine. But if you're returning something, it should be a function. So JavaScript takes that promise and it try to call that, right? But it's no longer a function. So that's why the error that we saw in the application that was popping up, right? So I hope that helps, right? So yeah, so in order to solve this, what is the best solution for this? The solution is pretty simple. Whenever you are basically working with React in useEffect, the best practice is that basically write your logic of doing any side effect, making API call, updating the state inside a function, and call this function, right? And that this function can be async, and you can use await inside of it. Why there is no problem here making this async function async? Because you are no longer making this callback async, right? So that is fine, right? So this callback will not return anything. You are using a function, and inside that function you can make it async, and it will work. Why? Right? Because it is executing